Dopamine is a chemical that your brain produces naturally, but it's also essential to the functioning of many other body parts. For example, it's involved in feelings of pleasure and happiness, motivation and excitement. Even eating certain foods or playing video games can trigger dopamine secretion. In its basic form, dopamine helps regulate movement and coordination by sending signals from one nerve cell to another. But this neurotransmitter also affects cognition, moods, notably when someone feels happy, attention span, and impulse control. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, the chemical that nerve cells use to send signals to each other, that's essential to the brain's reward system. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's essential to the brain's reward system. It's involved in the pleasure centers of your brain, so it makes sense that dopamine plays a role in creating motivation and desire. Dopamine is also a neurotransmitter, or brain chemical, which helps nerve cells communicate with each other by passing signals from one cell to another. It's part of feeling pleasure, happiness, excitement, and motivation. It's in play when you do something over and over again, video games, eating certain foods, and it's involved in the rush you might feel after finishing a risky task or a complex problem. Think skydiving. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical messenger in the brain. It's also involved in feelings of pleasure and happiness, motivation, risk-taking, and reward anticipation. When you do something over and over again, video games, eating certain foods, dopamine is released. It's part of feeling pleasure, happiness, and excitement. It's also released when you do something risky or difficult because there's potential for a reward at the end. Think skydiving. Even though dopamine receptors exist in various places in the body, they significantly affect behavior and cognition in the prefrontal cortex, behind your forehead, which is responsible for motor control, personality expression, and decision-making. The brain releases dopamine to reward behavior that helps an organism survive. Dopamine is also responsible for motor control, personality expression, and decision-making. Dopamine receptors are found in many different body parts and can be activated by over 100 neurotransmitters, such as norepinephrine, serotonin, and epinephrine, adrenaline. It's not just an ordinary chemical that travels around your body. Your brain has multiple systems for regulating dopamine levels, from the amount produced to how quickly it degrades, so it stays within a safe range. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that acts on both pre- and postsynaptic neurons to regulate nerve impulses. It's synthesized in presynaptic neurons, travels through a gap between these cells called the synapse, and then binds with receptors on postsynaptic neurons to trigger an action potential. Dopamine also acts as a watcher molecule for other neurotransmitters. When it reaches its receptor sites on other cells, it sends signals about how much of them are present, whether they're too low or high, so you can adjust accordingly by switching off or boosting the flow of dopamine as needed. But there's one more thing about dopamine: it can degrade over time if not used properly. This natural degradation is part of what allows us to feel satisfaction from what we've done today, or yesterday. This means there's no way around it. If you want optimal levels flowing through your brain all day long and night, then make sure that whatever activities introduce extra dopamine into your body aren't leading towards any harmful behavior like drug use or extreme dieting attempts. You may feel less motivated and more lethargic if your dopamine levels get too low. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a role in the brain's reward system, which helps you feel motivated and happy. Unfortunately, your dopamine levels can get too low when you do something repeatedly, video games or eating certain foods. This leads to feelings of lethargy, apathy, and depression, even if you don't have any other obvious health issues. If your dopamine levels get too low, you may feel less motivated and more lethargic than usual. If your levels are too high, you might feel like your movements are restricted. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, the chemical nerve cells use to send signals to each other, essential to the brain's reward system. This means that dopamine helps control our desire for things we enjoy: food, sex, exercise, you name it. So the more dopamine in your brain, the more pleasurable experiences become for you. There is some evidence about how chronic conditions can affect dopamine receptors. For instance, people with Parkinson's disease have fewer dopamine receptors than most people, which contributes to the freezing sensation they often experience. There is some evidence about how chronic conditions can affect dopamine receptors. For instance, people with Parkinson's disease have fewer dopamine receptors than most people, which contributes to the freezing sensation they often experience. Dopamine can also be affected by other factors. For example, diabetes reduces levels of this neurotransmitter in your brain and body. In addition, dopamine is involved in motivation and reward processing. So if you're having trouble motivating yourself or getting things done at work because of low levels of this chemical in your brain, or if you suffer from depression, it could be time to try something new. Conclusion. Dopamine is a brain chemical that affects how we feel and act. It's produced in the midbrain and travels to the prefrontal cortex, behind your forehead, affecting decision-making, behavior, mood, and motivation. If you have low levels of dopamine in your brain or if it doesn't work correctly, you may have symptoms such as depression and other conditions like Parkinson's disease or ADHD.